The crystal chandelier swayed as Lady Millicent Ashford's knees buckled beneath her. She caught herself against the marble pillar, porcelain teacups shattering at her feet, their contents pooling across the ballroom floor like accusations. 200 faces turned toward the sound, not with concern, but with that particular brand of aristocratic irritation reserved for those who disrupt carefully orchestrated perfection. "Good God, Millicent," her sister-in-law Constance hissed, descending upon her with the swift precision of a hawk upon a wounded dove. "Can you not perform even the simplest task without catastrophe?" Millicent's hands trembled. They had been trembling for weeks now, a fact no one had noticed because no one looked at her long enough to see. She opened her mouth to apologize. The reflex was so deeply ingrained it required no thought, but the words dissolved on her tongue. She was so very tired of apologizing for existing. She began, "spare us your excuses." Constance gripped her elbow, fingers digging into the bruise already forming there from yesterday's incident, when Millicent had carried a trunk of linens up 3 flights of stairs because the footman had been occupied elsewhere. "Go to the servants' hall, immediately. You've embarrassed us quite enough for one evening." Lady Pemberton, resplendent in emerald silk, leaned toward her companion with a stage whisper designed to carry. Poor Constance, such a burden, housing that peculiar creature. One would think 7 years of charity would be sufficient. Millicent walked through the glittering crowd, her unfashionable grey gown a smudge against their jewel-toned finery, and felt the weight of 200 gazes slide away from her as though she were merely a shadow passing across a mirror. She had become exceptionally good at being a shadow. Millicent Ashford carried a truth no one ever asked her to explain. That pain, when ignored long enough, does not disappear. It simply learns to exist in smaller and smaller spaces until the person carrying it becomes little more than a vessel of silent suffering, walking among the oblivious with a smile that never reaches her eyes. She had been the youngest daughter of Baron Hartley, a man whose kindness had far exceeded his fortune. When he died, leaving behind debts and daughters, Millicent had been saved by an unexpected proposal from Thomas Ashford, second son of Lord Ashford of Ashford Manor. Thomas had been gentle, bookish, utterly unlike the ambitious aristocrats who populated their world. He had seen something in Millicent that others overlooked, a quiet intelligence, a capacity for deep feeling, a spirit that had not yet learned to make itself small. Their marriage had been brief, but genuinely happy. 18 months of shared books and quiet conversations, of planning a future that would never arrive. Thomas died when his horse threw him during a hunt, and Millicent, 5 months pregnant with their child, felt her world shatter into pieces too small to gather. The baby came early, a son, perfect and still, who lived only long enough for Millicent to hold him once before he slipped away into whatever realm claims those too fragile for this world. She was 22 years old and had lost everything. The Ashford family, in their limited mercy, allowed her to remain at the manor, not out of love. Thomas's brothers had barely known her, and his father was too consumed with his own declining health to concern himself with a widowed daughter-in-law who had failed to produce an heir. But turning her out entirely would have been unseemly, and the Ashfords prided themselves on maintaining appearances. So Millicent stayed, and slowly, imperceptibly, she stopped being a member of the family and became something else entirely, a repository for every task too tedious for the legitimate Ashfords to perform, every responsibility too beneath them to acknowledge, every burden too inconvenient to shoulder themselves. It happened so gradually that Millicent herself could not identify the precise moment when she crossed from grieving widow to unpaid servant. Perhaps it was when Constance first asked her to review the household accounts. "Since you have so much time on your hands," Or perhaps it was when Lord Ashford's sons began referring to her as useful little Millicent, with that particular tone that suggested utility was her only value. Perhaps it was when the servants began coming to her with problems instead of to Constance, recognizing that Millicent would actually solve them rather than simply complain about their existence. 7 years had passed since Thomas's death. 7 years of managing Ashford Manor's intricate machinery, while others took credit for its smooth operation. 7 years of nursing Lord Ashford through illnesses, mediating family disputes, organizing social events, maintaining correspondence, training new servants, mending what was broken, and holding together what threatened to fall apart. 7 years of being indispensable. 7 years of being invisible. Millicent risked losing what remained of herself, not through any dramatic rupture, but through the slow erosion of a soul that had poured itself out in service to others, until nothing remained but an empty shell performing motions it no longer remembered the meaning of. She risked disappearing entirely while still breathing, still walking, still serving, becoming a ghost who haunted the edges of other people's lives without ever claiming space in her own. The night of the Duchess of Worthington's gala, Millicent walked back to Ashford Manor through rain that fell like cold judgment. Her thin cloak provided little protection, and by the time she reached the estate's iron gates, she was soaked through, shivering, her teeth chattering with a cold that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than her bones. The manor blazed with light. Through the windows she could see another gathering in progress. Constance had mentioned something about a card party, had left detailed instructions about refreshments and seating arrangements, had assumed Millicent would handle everything as she always did. Millicent stood in the rain, staring at that golden light, and felt something inside her shift, not break. Breaking would have been too violent, too noticeable. This was quieter, a tether finally fraying through, a decision made not in anger, but in the profound exhaustion of someone who had simply reached the absolute limit of what they could endure. She turned away from the manor and walked into the darkness of the estate grounds. The groundskeeper's cottage stood at the furthest edge of the property, hidden among a copse of ancient oaks. It had been empty since old Thomas, she smiled grimly at the coincidence of the name, had died the previous winter. The family had discussed hiring a replacement, but had never quite gotten around to it. And the cottage had sat vacant, slowly being reclaimed by ivy and neglect. Millicent tried the door. The latch gave easily, and she stepped into a darkness that smelled of must and abandonment and blessed, blessed solitude. She found candles in a drawer, struck a match with trembling fingers, and watched weak light bloom across the single room. The furniture was simple: a narrow bed, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth. Dust covered everything in a grey shroud. It was perfect. For the first time in 7 years, Millicent was somewhere no one would think to look for her, somewhere no one needed her, somewhere she could simply exist without the constant weight of others' expectations pressing down upon her shoulders like a physical burden. She removed her sodden cloak, built a small fire in the hearth, and sat at the wooden table as warmth slowly crept back into her frozen limbs. The silence was extraordinary. No bells summoning her to attend to some minor crisis, no voices calling her name with that particular inflection of irritated entitlement, no footsteps approaching with yet another task that simply could not wait, just silence, just breath, just the crackling of the fire and the rain against the windows, and the slow, tentative unfurling of something inside her that had been clenched tight for so long she had forgotten it existed. Millicent laid her head on her arms and wept. Not the silent, careful tears she had learned to cry in the privacy of her small room at the manor, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from the very center of her being. She wept for her lost husband and her lost child. She wept for the girl she had been, who had loved music and laughter, and believed the world held beauty worth discovering. She wept for 7 years of service without gratitude, of labor without recognition, of existing as a convenience rather than as a person. And when the tears finally stopped, when she was empty and exhausted and strangely, surprisingly calm, Millicent made a decision. She would stay, not forever. She did not yet know what forever might look like, but for now. For as long as it took to remember who she was, beneath the accumulated weight of everyone else's needs, she would stay, and she would let them manage without her. And she would see what happened when the invisible woman finally, deliberately chose to disappear. The first day of Millicent's absence passed almost unnoticed. Constance, occupied with her own affairs, assumed Millicent was sulking after the previous evening's embarrassment. Lord Ashford, confined to his bed with another bout of the respiratory illness that plagued him, asked for her once, but accepted the nurse's explanation that Lady Millicent was indisposed. The servants exchanged puzzled glances when she did not appear for her usual morning rounds, but they had their own tasks and assumed she would emerge eventually. It was not until the second day that the absence began to create visible fissures in the household's routine. Cook appeared at Constance's morning room, wringing her hands. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Lady Millicent always provides the weekly menu by Tuesday morning. The fishmonger is waiting for our order, and the butcher needs to know quantities for the weekend dinner party." Constance waved a dismissive hand. "Surely you can manage a simple menu without constant supervision, Cook." "Yes, ma'am, but Lady Millicent knows Lord Ashford's dietary restrictions and the guests' preferences. She keeps detailed notes on who dislikes what, who requires special preparation. Then consult her notes." "I've looked, ma'am. She keeps it all in her head. Says it's more efficient that way." It had been more efficient for everyone but Millicent, who carried the intricate web of the household's needs in her mind, like a merchant carrying his entire inventory without benefit of ledger or list. Constance felt the first flicker of genuine irritation. "Where is Millicent?" "No one's seen her since the gala, ma'am." "Well, find her, tell her she's needed." But Millicent could not be found. Her small room in the servants' wing, for despite being family, she had been relegated to quarters barely larger than a closet, showed signs of hasty packing. Several dresses were missing. Her mother's journal was gone. The letters from her late husband, which she kept tied with blue ribbon in her drawer, had vanished. Mrs. Daventry, the housekeeper, reported this to Constance with poorly concealed worry. "It appears Lady Millicent may have left the manor, ma'am." "Left? Don't be absurd. Where would she go? She has no money, no family, no prospects." Mrs. Daventry said nothing, but her silence was eloquent. By the third day, the household had begun to fracture. The dinner party Constance had planned descended into chaos. The fish course arrived overcooked because Cook had misjudged the timing. The wine was wrong, red served with sole, white with beef, because the footman did not know the proper pairings. The flowers in the centerpieces were wilting because no one had remembered to change the water. The seating arrangement placed two bitter rivals next to each other, resulting in an atmosphere of frigid politeness that infected the entire table. Lady Pemberton, seated at Constance's right, observed the disasters with barely concealed delight. "How unfortunate, my dear. Your household seems to have lost its usual polish. I do hope nothing is amiss with your staff." Constance's smile was rigid. A temporary disruption. Nothing of consequence. But it was of consequence, and the consequences multiplied with each passing day. The tradesmen began appearing at the door with unpaid bills and demands for settlement. Millicent had always managed these accounts, juggling the family's limited resources with the skill of a seasoned banker, stretching funds through careful negotiation and strategic timing. Without her, the carefully maintained house of cards began to collapse. Lady Constance, Mrs. Daventry said on the fifth day, her voice tight with stress. The draper is refusing further credit until the outstanding balance is paid. The grocer says the same. And the coal merchant will not make another delivery without payment in advance. How much is owed? Mrs. Daventry consulted her notes. To the draper, £17, the grocer, £23, the coal merchant, £41. Constance paled. Impossible. We pay our accounts regularly. Lady Millicent paid them regularly, ma'am. She had arrangements with each merchant, sometimes delaying one to pay another, sometimes negotiating extended terms, sometimes using her own portion to cover shortfalls when the household accounts ran low. Her own portion. The pittance the Ashfords allocated to Millicent for personal expenses, which she had quietly poured back into maintaining the household that barely acknowledged her existence. Constance felt the first stirrings of something that might have been shame had she been capable of recognizing it. In the village, Millicent's absence created its own ripples. Mrs. Whitmore, the vicar's wife, arrived at the charity school on Tuesday afternoon to find chaos. The children were unsupervised. 2 were fighting, and the small supply of books and materials had been depleted without replacement. "Where is Lady Millicent?" she asked Miss Peters, the young teacher. "I don't know, ma'am. She didn't come this week." "Did she send word?" "No, ma'am, but she's been coming every Tuesday for 6 years without fail. I assumed if she wasn't here, something must be wrong." Mrs. Whitmore felt worry knot in her stomach. She sent a note to Ashford Manor, inquiring after Millicent's health, and received a curt reply from Constance stating that Lady Millicent was temporarily indisposed and would return to her duties when convenient. The phrasing troubled Mrs. Whitmore. It sounded less like illness and more like punishment. Old Mr. Harrow, who tended the churchyard, noticed the absence in his own way. Every week for 7 years, Lady Millicent had visited her husband's and son's graves, bringing fresh flowers, spending time in quiet contemplation. Mr. Harrow had come to rely on these visits, not just because she was faithful in her grief, but because she always stopped to speak with him afterward. Real conversation, not the cursory acknowledgments most gentry offered. She had asked about his grandchildren, remembered their names and ages, inquired about his wife's rheumatism. When his grandson had been studying to become a clerk, she had brought books to help with his education, good books, expensive books, given with such casual kindness that it had taken Mr. Harrow weeks to fully comprehend the generosity. Now the graves went unattended, and Mr. Harrow found himself looking toward the church gate every afternoon, hoping to see her slight figure approaching. She never came. In the cottage, Millicent was discovering what it meant to inhabit a life of her own choosing. She woke with the sun, no longer jerked from sleep by the demands of others. She prepared simple meals, bread and cheese, soup from vegetables she found in the cottage's small garden, tea that she drank slowly while watching the light change through the trees. She cleaned the cottage methodically, taking pleasure in each small transformation. Dust swept away, windows washed until they sparkled, the narrow bed made with the linens she had brought, crisp and clean and hers alone. She walked in the woods at dawn, feeling frost crunch beneath her feet, watching her breath mist in the cold air. She had forgotten how beautiful the world could be when you were not rushing through it toward the next obligation. She read. Oh, how she read. The books she had brought from her room, volumes she had accumulated over years but never had time to open, now lay scattered across the table, each one an invitation to escape, to think, to simply be in the presence of ideas and stories that had nothing to do with household management or aristocratic obligation. She read philosophy and poetry. She read novels that made her laugh and novels that made her weep. She read essays on art and travel accounts from Italy and France. Places she had once dreamed of seeing before duty had narrowed her world to the confines of Ashford Manor. and in the evenings, by candlelight, she read the letters from her late husband. She had not looked at them in years. The pain had been too fresh, and then the pain had been buried too deep. And then she had simply forgotten that pain was allowed to exist outside the narrow boundaries of usefulness. Now she unfolded them carefully, these testimonies to a love that had been real and brief and transformative. "My dearest Millicent," Thomas had written during their courtship, "you possess a gentleness that this world does not deserve, but desperately needs. I find myself grateful beyond measure that you have agreed to share your life with mine. I promise to treasure the gift of your presence every day we are granted together." Had he known how few days they would have? Had he somehow sensed the brevity of their time and loved her more fiercely because of it? Another letter, written just weeks before his death. "You are teaching me that strength is not always loud, my love, that there is courage in kindness, power in patience. I watch you navigate this complicated family with such grace, never diminishing yourself, but never seeking to dominate either. You are a light in rooms that have known too much shadow." Millicent traced the words with her finger, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. Not bitter tears, not the wrenching sobs of her first night in the cottage, but something gentler. Grief, yes, but also gratitude that she had been loved this way, even briefly, that someone had seen her truly and valued what they saw. She had forgotten that version of herself, the woman Thomas had loved, the woman who played music and laughed easily and believed in her own worth. When had she lost that woman? The answer came quietly. She had not lost her. She had given her away, piece by piece, year by year, until nothing remained but the hollow shell of service and silence. But hollow things, Millicent realized, could be filled again. By the 7th day, Ashford Manor was in genuine crisis. Lord Ashford's health had deteriorated sharply. The nurse, overwhelmed by his complex needs and unfamiliar with his particular ailments, had made several dangerous errors. She administered the wrong dosage of medication, forgot to elevate his legs to prevent fluid retention, failed to notice when his breathing became labored in the night. Only luck and the butler's timely intervention prevented catastrophe. When Lord Ashford was finally stabilized, he demanded an accounting. "Where is Millicent?" he rasped, his voice weak but sharp with fury. His eldest son, George, summoned from London by an urgent telegram, stood at the bedside looking uncomfortable. "We're not certain, Father. She appears to have left the manor temporarily." "Left? When?" "Nearly a week ago. And no one thought to inform me. No one thought to search for her." Lord Ashford struggled to sit up, his face flushed with anger. "That girl has nursed me through 3 bouts of pneumonia, countless flare-ups of gout, and the infection that nearly killed me last winter. She has sat by this bed for hours, days, without complaint, without expectation of thanks, without a single word of protest. And you let her disappear for a week without even noticing." Nor George had the grace to look ashamed. "We assumed she needed time to herself." "You assumed nothing." Lord Ashford's shout dissolved into coughing. When he could speak again, his voice was quieter, but no less intense. "You took her for granted. You all did. You used her up and expected her to be grateful for the privilege. Do not lie to me, George. I am dying, and I will not spend my final months listening to comfortable falsehoods." He fixed his son with a look of withering contempt. "Millicent has been the beating heart of this household for 7 years, and you treated her like a servant. Worse than a servant. At least servants are paid for their labor and given proper quarters and days off. What did you give Millicent?" "We gave her a home. You gave her a prison." The old man's fury was magnificent and terrible. "A room the size of a closet, barely enough money for basic necessities, no privacy, no freedom, no acknowledgement of her value as a person. And when she finally had the courage to leave, you didn't even notice for 3 days." The words hung in the air like an indictment. George stood silent, the truth of his father's accusations settling over him like ash. "Find her," Lord Ashford commanded. "Find her and bring her back, not to serve, not to resume her duties, but because I need to apologize to her before I die, because she deserves to hear that at least one person in this God-forsaken family recognizes what she sacrificed. Find her, George, or don't bother visiting my deathbed again." George began his search that afternoon. He questioned every servant, examined Millicent's abandoned room, spoke with tradesmen and villagers. Slowly, painstakingly, a portrait emerged of a woman he had never truly seen. The housekeeper told him about the Christmas bonuses Millicent had quietly funded from her own portion when Constance declared there was no money for such frivolities. "She made sure every servant received something, sir. Even the scullery maid, who'd only been here 3 months, said everyone deserves to feel valued at Christmas." The cook spoke of Millicent's endless patience in the kitchen, never complaining when asked to accommodate yet another last-minute dietary restriction or unexpected guest. "She'd roll up her sleeves and help us prepare meals, sir. A lady, working alongside us like it was the most natural thing in the world. Never acted like she was better than us." The young maid Mary wept as she recounted how Millicent had taught her to read, spending every Sunday afternoon for an entire year working through primers and simple texts. "My mum's sick now, sir, and I can read the Bible to her because Lady Millicent took the time to teach me. She said every person deserves the gift of reading." The groom described how Millicent had sat with his dying wife last spring, holding her hand and reading to her even though they'd barely spoken before. "My Bess wasn't nobody important, sir, just a groom's wife. But Lady Millicent treated her like she mattered. Came every day for 2 weeks until Bess passed. Even came to the funeral, stood in the rain with the rest of us. I never forgot that kindness." Each story was a stone, and together they built a monument to a woman George realized he had lived alongside for 7 years without knowing at all. In the village, the stories multiplied. The schoolteacher spoke of Millicent's faithful assistance with the charity school, her ability to connect with even the most difficult children, her thoughtful gifts of books and materials. The vicar mentioned her quiet contributions to the Poor Relief Fund, donations she made anonymously, but which he recognized because she was the only one who understood which families needed help most. The shopkeeper's wife recalled how Millicent always took time to inquire about people's families, remembered birthdays and anniversaries, made everyone feel seen and valued regardless of their station. George felt shame settle over him like a heavy coat. How had he missed this? How had they all missed this? The answer was simple and devastating. They had not looked. Millicent had been convenient to overlook. Her pain had asked nothing of them, demanded nothing from them, and so they had allowed it to remain invisible. They had mistaken her silence for contentment, her endurance for acceptance, her survival for thriving. They had taken and taken and taken until she had nothing left to give. And then, when she finally removed herself from their reach, they had felt the absence like a wound. George found her on the 10th day. He had searched the estate methodically, but it was old Mr. Harrow who provided the final clue. "Sometimes I see smoke from the groundskeeper's cottage, sir, up past the old oak grove. Haven't been that way myself, but it might be worth checking." The cottage was easy to miss, hidden among the trees, but George saw the thin curl of smoke from the chimney and knew. He approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome. When he knocked, there was a long pause before the door opened. Millicent stood in the doorway, and George was struck by how different she looked. Not diminished, as he had feared, but somehow more present. Her hair was unpinned, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her dress was simple, slightly faded but clean. Her face was calm, untroubled, almost serene. She looked like a woman who had finally stopped running from herself. "George," she said, her voice betraying neither surprise nor welcome. "Millicent." He removed his hat, suddenly unsure how to proceed. "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. The cottage was small but tidy. A fire burned low in the hearth. Books were stacked on the table beside the remains of a simple meal. It looked, George realized, like a life, a small life perhaps, but one chosen freely rather than endured through obligation. "We've been looking for you," he said. "I rather hoped you wouldn't find me." Her honesty was disarming. George had prepared speeches, carefully constructed apologies, but they all seemed inadequate in the face of her quiet directness. "The household has fallen apart without you," he tried. "Then perhaps it was too fragile to begin with." There was no bitterness in her voice, only observation. George studied this woman who had lived under his roof for 7 years, whom he had categorized as useful little Millicent and then promptly forgotten. He saw her now, truly saw her, and felt the full weight of his negligence. "My father is asking for you. He's not well." Something flickered in Millicent's eyes, concern perhaps, or memory of the small kindnesses Lord Ashford had shown her when others offered only demands. "Is he in pain?" "Yes, physical pain, certainly. But I think the greater pain is knowing how badly we've failed you." Millicent moved to the window, looking out at the forest beyond. "Why now, George? Why does my value only become apparent in my absence?" It was the question he had been asking himself for days. "Because we are fools, because we confused your strength for weakness and your generosity for obligation, because we never imagined you might choose yourself over us." "I did not choose myself over you. I simply chose myself at all." She turned to face him. "Do you understand the difference?" He nodded slowly. "I think I'm beginning to. For 7 years, I gave everything I had to that house, to that family. I gave my time, my energy, my health, my peace, my hope. I gave until I was empty, until I could not remember who I had been before I became useful, and no one, not one person, ever asked if I was tired, if I needed help, if I wanted something different. I know. Do you truly?" Millicent's voice remained calm, but emotion threaded through it now. "When I collapsed at the gala, Constance's first concern was that I had embarrassed her. Not that I might be unwell, not that carrying a tray was inappropriate for a family member, not that perhaps I had been asked to do too much for too long, just embarrassment that I had disrupted her perfect evening." George flinched at the accuracy of the observation. "I did not leave in anger," Millicent continued. "I left because I realized that if I stayed, I would disappear completely, not through death, but through that slower erasure of being needed without being valued, being used without being seen. I left because I deserved better than existence as a convenient solution to other people's problems. You did, you do." George moved closer, his expression earnest. "Millicent, I cannot undo the past 7 years. I cannot give you back what we took from you. But I can offer you a choice now. Come back to the manor, not as you were, but as you should have been from the beginning. As a cherished member of the family, with your own income, your own authority, your own life. Or don't come back at all. Either way, you'll have financial independence. This cottage is yours if you want it, along with enough money to live comfortably. You'll never be dependent on our charity again." Millicent searched his face, looking for sincerity, for the catch, for the conditions that would inevitably be attached to such an offer. She found only genuine regret. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because you've earned it 1,000 times over. Because my father is dying, and he wants to see you treated with the respect you should have always received." George paused. And because I am ashamed, Millicent, deeply, profoundly ashamed of how blind I've been, how blind we've all been. Silence stretched between them. If I return, Millicent said finally, things must be different. They will be. You have my word. Words have been cheap in that house, George. Then let me prove it through actions. Name your terms. Millicent considered. She had spent 10 days in solitude. 10 days, remembering who she was beneath the weight of obligation. She had found peace here, found herself here, but she had also realized that running away was not the same as moving forward. And there were people at the manor she cared about. Lord Ashford, who had shown her small kindnesses when others offered only demands. The servants, who had become friends. Even the village, where her work mattered in ways the Ashfords had never acknowledged. She did not want to return to what had been, but perhaps she could return to something new. I will visit your father, she said, because despite everything, he has been kind to me in his way, and because I believe his suffering is genuine, but I will not resume managing the household. That is not my responsibility, and it never should have been. Agreed. I want my own rooms. Real rooms, George, not a closet in the servants' wing. Privacy, space, a place that is mine. The East Wing has been closed for years. You can have your choice of rooms there. I'll have them prepared immediately. I want an independent income, not an allowance from Constance or controlled by the family. My own money, managed by a solicitor I select, enough to live on whether I stay at the manor or not. You'll have it. I'll arrange it with our man of business this week. And I want respect. Millicent's voice was steady. I want to be spoken to as a person, not as a servant or a burden or a convenient solution. I want my pain to matter as much as anyone else's. I want my needs to be considered, not overlooked. I want to be seen, George, truly seen. The fact that she had to ask for such basic human dignity broke something in George's heart. You have it, he promised. All of it. And Millicent. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Thank you for not giving up on us entirely, for giving us a chance to do better. She smiled faintly. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. Because I deserve better than disappearing into bitterness in a cottage in the woods, because I'm choosing forgiveness, not because you've earned it, but because I refuse to let your neglect define the rest of my life. It was, George thought, the most dignified thing he had ever heard anyone say. Millicent returned to Ashford Manor the next morning. She walked through the front door this time, not the servants' entrance, her head high and her step steady. George had arranged for a carriage, but she had chosen to walk, wanting to arrive on her own terms, in her own time, carried by her own strength rather than theirs. The household was in chaos. Servants rushed about with harried expressions. Constance's voice could be heard from the drawing room, raised in frustration over some domestic failure. The smell of something burning drifted from the kitchens. Millicent observed it all with the detachment of someone who had learned, finally, that other people's chaos was not hers to fix. George met her in the entrance hall. Your rooms are ready, the East Wing, as promised, and I've spoken with the family. You're to be treated with proper respect, or they'll answer to me. We'll see, Millicent said. She had learned not to trust promises until they became actions. She went directly to Lord Ashford's room. The old man's face transformed when he saw her. Relief, joy, and something like anguish chased across his weathered features. Millie, he whispered, using the name only he dared. Oh, my dear girl, forgive me. Millicent crossed to his bedside and took his trembling hand in hers. His skin was paper-thin, cool to the touch. She could see death hovering at the edges of him, patient and inevitable. There is nothing to forgive, she said gently. There is everything to forgive. Tears tracked down his cheeks. settling in the deep lines carved by age and regret. I allowed them to treat you abominably. I saw what was happening and did nothing. I was comfortable with your sacrifice because it made my life easier. I am a coward and a fool, and I do not deserve your kindness." "You were kind to me when kindness was scarce," Millicent said. "You spoke to me as though my thoughts mattered. You asked about my day, about my interests. You remembered my birthday, small things perhaps, but they sustained me." "Small things?" Lord Ashford's laugh was bitter. "You gave us everything, and I gave you small things." "Small things matter, Lord Ashford. Sometimes they matter most of all. They remind us we're human when the world would prefer to make us invisible." She stayed with him through the afternoon, reading the passages he loved, adjusting his pillows, simply being present. It was familiar work, but the context had changed. She was here by choice now. That made all the difference. When Lord Ashford finally slept, his breathing easier than it had been in weeks, Millicent went to explore her new quarters. The east wing was magnificent. George had given her not a single room but a suite, a bedroom with an actual bed large enough to be comfortable, a sitting room with windows that overlooked the gardens, a private study with built-in bookshelves. The furniture was elegant without being ostentatious. Fresh flowers stood in vases on every surface, and there, in the corner of the sitting room, stood a pianoforte. Millicent approached it slowly, hardly daring to believe it was real. She had not played in years. There had been no time, and even if there had been, the family piano in the drawing room was constantly in use by Constance's daughters for their endless, mediocre practice sessions. But this instrument was hers. She sat at the bench, placed her fingers on the keys, and played a simple melody. The notes were hesitant at first, her fingers stiff from disuse, but gradually they remembered. The music flowed, tentative then stronger, filling the room with sound that was hers alone. Tears streamed down her face as she played. Not tears of sadness, though there was sadness in them, not tears of joy, though there was joy too. These were tears of reclamation, of finding a part of herself she had thought lost forever, of discovering that buried things could be unearthed, that forgotten things could be remembered, that the person she had been before grief and obligation had diminished her was still there, waiting patiently to be acknowledged. She played until her hands ached and the light faded from the windows and the dinner bell rang in the distance. She did not go down to dinner. That small rebellion, choosing her own peace over their expectations, felt like the most radical act she had ever committed. The changes at Ashford Manor were not dramatic, but they were real, and they were lasting. George hired a proper housekeeper, a competent woman named Mrs. Blackwell, who took over the management of household accounts, staff supervision, and domestic organization. He increased the wages for all servants and established clear guidelines for their duties and their time off. He arranged for Millicent's independent income through a reputable solicitor in London. The amount was generous, enough to live comfortably whether she remained at the manor or chose to establish her own household elsewhere. He instituted family dinners where Millicent was seated in a place of honor, her opinions solicited, her contributions acknowledged. Constance resisted at first, her resentment palpable every time she was forced to treat Millicent as an equal rather than a subordinate. But George was firm, and gradually, very gradually, Constance's active hostility diminished into cold civility. It was not friendship, it would likely never be friendship, but it was an improvement. The servants responded to Millicent's return with genuine joy, tempered by caution. They had seen how she'd been treated before, and they worried the same patterns would reassert themselves. But Millicent was different now. She visited the kitchens not to manage, but to enjoy Cook's company. She asked the maids about their families and actually listened to the answers. She offered help when asked, but did not assume responsibility for problems that were not hers to solve. She had learned, finally, the difference between generosity and self-destruction. Mrs. Daventry approached her one afternoon in the garden. "Lady Millicent," I wanted to say. We're all so glad you came back. But we're gladder still that you left. Does that make sense?" Millicent smiled. "Perfect sense, Mrs. Daventry. You're different now, stronger somehow, like you remember who you are." "I do remember," Millicent said softly. Finally. In the village, Millicent's return was celebrated with genuine warmth. She resumed her work at the charity school, but on her own terms. Every Tuesday afternoon, never more, never less. She brought books and materials, worked with the children who struggled, encouraged those with talent. But when the session ended, she left, giving her time generously, but not endlessly. Mrs. Whitmore embraced her with tears in her eyes. "We thought perhaps you'd left for good. We wouldn't have blamed you if you had." "I considered it," Millicent admitted, "but I realized that running away from the people who hurt me would not heal the hurt. I had to learn to value myself first. Now I can be here without losing myself." The children presented her with a collection of drawings they'd made during her absence, crude but heartfelt pictures of flowers and houses, and one remarkably accurate rendering of Millicent herself. Standing in front of the school with a book in her hands, she pressed the drawings to her chest, overwhelmed. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you so much." Old Mr. Harrow was waiting for her in the churchyard the following Sunday. He stood beside her husband's and son's graves, his hat in his hands, his weathered face creased with emotion. "Lady Millicent, I wanted to thank you proper. For the kindness to my grandson, for the time you spent with my Bess, for always treating me like I mattered. I should have said it before. Should have said it 100 times." Millicent placed her hand on his arm. "You're saying it now, Mr. Harrow. That's what matters. My grandson got the clerk position, starts next month. Wouldn't have happened without those books you gave him, without your encouragement. I'm so pleased to hear it. You must be very proud." "I am, my lady. I am." He paused, struggling with words. "When you disappeared, I worried we'd never see you again. Worried that the world had finally ground you down, the way it grinds down all good people who give too much. I'm glad I was wrong." "The world tried," Millicent said. "But I'm more resilient than I knew. Lord Ashford's health stabilized, and while he remained frail, his spirits improved remarkably. Millicent visited him daily, but now she came as a guest rather than a nurse. They talked about books, about politics, about his regrets and her hopes. He asked about her plans, encouraged her dreams, and slowly, in the time remaining to him, tried to make amends for years of benign neglect. "I'm leaving you something in my will," he told her one afternoon. "Not a fortune, but enough to ensure you're never dependent on anyone again. You don't have to." "I do. I absolutely do. And Millie, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll use it to live. Not just to survive, but to truly live. Go to Italy like you've always wanted. Learn to paint, play music, fall in love again if the opportunity presents itself. Don't let what this family did to you define what you can become." Millicent squeezed his hand. "I promise. Good girl. You deserve every happiness this world has to offer. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." George proved true to his word in ways that surprised even Millicent. He began truly seeing the people around him, servants, tenants, villagers, asking questions, listening to answers, recognizing that every person had value beyond their utility. He sought Millicent's advice not on household management, but on matters of genuine substance. What did she think of the new agricultural policies? Had she read the latest novel everyone was discussing? What were her thoughts on the education reforms being debated in Parliament? At first, Millicent answered cautiously, waiting for the trap, the dismissal, the moment when her opinions would be revealed as unwanted after all. But the trap never came. George genuinely valued her intelligence, her insight, her perspective shaped by occupying spaces between servant and family, visible and invisible. One evening, he found her in the music room, playing something complex and beautiful. He waited until she finished before speaking. "You play wonderfully." "I never knew." Millicent smiled. "No one ever asked." George settled into a nearby chair. "I've been thinking about what you said, about only being valued in your absence. It's haunted me, that observation. It wasn't meant to haunt you. Nevertheless, it has, because it's true, isn't it? We took you for granted until you were gone, and then suddenly we saw what you'd been holding together all along." "Yes. I've been wondering, do you think most people are like that, only capable of seeing value when it's withdrawn?" Millicent considered the question. "I think people are capable of seeing value when they choose to look, but looking requires effort, and taking things for granted is so much easier. We assume the lamp will always burn, so we never think about the oil until the flame goes out. That's remarkably generous given how we treated you. It's not generosity, it's understanding human nature. We're all guilty of overlooking what's always been there. The difference is what we do when we're finally forced to see. And what are we doing? You're changing. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. That matters more than dramatic gestures or elaborate apologies. That's the difference between performing contrition and actually learning from your mistakes." George was quiet for a long moment. "You're staying then? Even with the option to leave?" "For now. I'm choosing to stay for now, and that's enough. I don't need to decide forever, just today, and then tomorrow, and then the day after that." "That seems wise. It's the only wisdom I've learned that I trust completely. That we don't have to commit to forever. We just have to commit to now, and let the future unfold as it will." Winter deepened, and with it came the season's social obligations. But this year, Millicent participated on her own terms. She attended dinners only when she chose to, and left early if she tired. She declined invitations that didn't interest her. She wore the dresses she liked rather than the ones Constance deemed appropriate for her station. And remarkably, the world did not end. The first time she excused herself from a gathering before it concluded, Lady Pemberton raised an eyebrow. "Leaving so soon, Lady Millicent?" "I find I'm tired, Lady Pemberton. I hope you'll excuse me." "Of course, my dear. Though I must say, you seem different lately. More—" She searched for the word. "Present, somehow." It was, Millicent thought, the most perceptive thing Lady Pemberton had ever said to her. "I am more present," she agreed. "I'm learning to occupy space, rather than simply existing in the margins of other people's lives." "How refreshing. You must tell me your secret." Millicent smiled. "I learned to disappear, and in my absence I discovered who I was. It's remarkable what you can see about yourself when you're no longer constantly looking at your reflection through other people's eyes." The words clearly confused Lady Pemberton, but Millicent didn't elaborate. Some truths were earned through experience, not explained through conversation. Christmas came, and with it, the first test of whether the changes at Ashford Manor were substantial or merely performative. Millicent received thoughtful gifts, books she had mentioned wanting, fine paper for correspondence, watercolours and brushes, because George remembered her mentioning she'd once wanted to learn to paint. But more meaningful than the gifts were the small acknowledgements woven through the day. Constance's daughters asked if she would play carols on the pianoforte, not because they needed her to, but because they enjoyed her playing. The servants presented her with a handkerchief they'd embroidered together, the words stitched in careful letters. "You were never invisible to those who truly saw." George raised a toast at dinner. "To Millicent, who taught us the difference between being needed and being valued, and who deserves far more of the latter than we ever gave her." And Lord Ashford, too weak to come down to dinner, sent a note that Millicent read alone in her room later that night. My dearest Millie, this may be my last Christmas. The doctor doesn't say so directly, but I can read the truth in his careful optimism. If it is my last, I'm grateful to spend it knowing that I finally acknowledged, however inadequately, the extraordinary gift of your presence in our lives. You deserved better than we gave you. You deserved recognition, gratitude, respect, and love. I hope the changes we've made, imperfect though they are, communicate what words cannot, that you matter. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are. May this Christmas be the first of many where you feel seen, valued, and treasured as you always should have been. With deep affection and deeper regret, Lord Ashford Millicent folded the letter carefully and added it to the bundle she kept tied with ribbon. Letters from people who had seen her truly across years and circumstances. Reminders that even when she felt invisible, someone had always been looking. She was no longer invisible now. She had learned to take up space, to claim her worth, to exist not in service to others' needs, but in honor of her own humanity. And that transformation, quiet and hard-won, was the greatest gift she could have given herself. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal, and with it came an envelope from Italy. Millicent opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an acceptance letter from an art school in Florence. She had written to them months ago, during her time in the cottage, when she had first begun to dream again of a life beyond Ashford Manor's boundaries. She had not mentioned the application to anyone, uncertain whether she would actually go through with it if accepted. Now the possibility was real and immediate and terrifying. 3 months in Florence, studying painting and drawing, living among artists and writers and people who created rather than merely maintained. 3 months of being Millicent Ashford, artist in training, rather than Millicent Ashford, tragic widow, convenient solution, invisible woman. George found her in the garden, staring at the letter with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Good news or bad?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet." She handed him the letter. He read it, then looked at her with genuine delight. "Millicent, this is wonderful. When do you leave?" "I haven't decided if I'm going." "Why wouldn't you go?" "Because..." She struggled to articulate the tangle of emotions. "Because I've only just found my place here. Because Lord Ashford is failing, and I don't want him to think I'm abandoning him. Because I'm afraid that if I leave, even temporarily, everything will slide back to how it was before." George sat beside her on the garden bench. "First, Lord Ashford would be devastated if you didn't go on his account. He told me himself he wants you to live, truly live, while you still have time. Second, if things slide back to how they were, that says more about us than about you. We need to be capable of change that persists whether you're here or not. And third, Millicent, you deserve this. You deserve beauty and art and adventure and every experience you've deferred for years. What if I'm not good enough? At painting, at any of it, at being the person who goes to Florence and studies art and has adventures? What if I'm only good at being useful?" George took her hand gently. "You were never only good at being useful. We made you feel that way because usefulness was all we bothered to notice. But your husband saw something else in you. Lord Ashford sees it. The servants see it. The village sees it. Even Constance, though she'd never admit it, sees it. The only person who still doubts is you." Millicent felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm afraid." "Of course you are. Fear is how we know something matters. But Millicent, imagine yourself at the end of your life. Which story would you rather tell? That you played it safe and stayed in your comfortable, familiar world? Or that you took a chance, that you chose possibility over certainty, that you honored the artist inside you who's been waiting patiently all these years for permission to exist?" She knew the answer, of course. She had always known the answer. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I'll go, and I'll paint, and I'll let myself be a beginner at something, and I'll stop apologizing for taking up space in the world." George smiled. "That sounds like the best decision you've ever made." Lord Ashford's reaction was everything Millicent could have hoped for. "Florence!" he exclaimed, his eyes bright with joy despite his physical weakness. "Oh, Millie, you must see the Duomo for me, and the Uffizi, and you must walk along the Arno at sunset. I went once when I was young, and I've never forgotten it." "I'll write you letters describing everything I see," Millicent promised. "Make them long letters, detailed. I want to live vicariously through your adventures." He gripped her hand. "This is what I wanted for you, not to stay here out of obligation or guilt, but to choose your life, whatever that life looks like. Promise me you won't come back unless you truly want to." "I promise. And promise me that if you find love there, or opportunity, or a life that suits you better than this one, you'll take it without a moment's hesitation." "Lord Ashford, promise me, Millie. I need to know that you're free, truly free." She promised, though her throat was tight with emotion. The household prepared for Millicent's departure with a mixture of genuine support and barely concealed anxiety. Constance, in a moment of unexpected vulnerability, approached Millicent the week before she was to leave. "I wanted to," Constance began, then stopped, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to wish you well in Italy. Thank you. And to say that I may not have always appreciated your contributions to this household." It was, Millicent knew, the closest Constance would ever come to an apology. "I appreciate you saying so. Will you come back?" The question surprised Millicent. "I haven't decided." "I hope you do, but I also hope. I hope you only come back if it's what you truly want, not because you feel obligated." Constance's expression was pained. "I've realized that we turned you into an obligation rather than a person. That was wrong of us. Of me, especially." Millicent studied her sister-in-law, seeing perhaps for the first time the insecurity beneath the hauteur, the fear beneath the control. "Thank you, Constance. That means more than you know." The servants threw her a farewell party in the kitchen, a small, warm gathering with too much food and genuine affection. They gave her a leather journal for recording her experiences, and each one had written a note inside: "Travel safely and come back with stories." Mrs. Daventry: "You taught me reading. May Italy teach you joy." Mary: "Thank you for seeing us when no one else did." Cook: "We'll miss you terribly, but we're glad you're going." Mr. Davies. The butler. Millicent wept over those notes, overcome by the realization that she had been seen after all. Not by those who should have seen her, perhaps, but by those who had learned to look. The morning of her departure arrived bright and clear. George drove her to the station himself, her modest trunk secured in the carriage. They rode in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke. "I owe you an apology I've never quite managed to articulate properly. George, please, let me say this." He turned to face her. "You saved our family, Millicent, not through dramatic gestures or grand sacrifices, but through the steady accumulation of small kindnesses, patient endurance, and grace under pressure. You held us together when we would have fallen apart, and we repaid you with neglect and contempt. I will regret that for the rest of my life." "You've changed things," Millicent said gently. "You've made amends through actions. That matters more than apologies." "Perhaps. But I want you to know that your absence taught me to see, to truly see people, not for what they can do for me, but for who they are. You gave me that gift, even though I didn't deserve it." The train station bustled with activity. George helped her with her trunk, purchased her ticket, and walked her to the platform. "Write to us," he said. "Let us know you're safe and happy." "I will. And Millicent, come back if you want to. Stay if you don't. Whatever you choose, you'll have our support." She embraced him, this man who had finally learned to see her. "Thank you, George, for everything." The train carried Millicent south through England, across the Channel, through France, and finally into Italy. She watched the landscape change outside her window. Rolling hills giving way to mountains, grey skies yielding to brilliant blue, the familiar becoming foreign and wonderful. She felt something unfurl inside her with each mile travelled, something that had been compressed and constrained for so long that she'd forgotten it existed. Hope, possibility, the sense that her life was her own to shape, her own to live, her own to claim. Florence welcomed her with golden light and ancient beauty. She stood in the Piazza della Signoria on her first morning, surrounded by art and history and people who didn't know she was the tragic widow Ashford, the useful little Millicent, the woman who disappeared because her pain was too inconvenient to acknowledge. Here, she was simply Millicent, a woman with a sketchbook and dreams. A woman learning to paint, a woman learning to take up space without apologizing, a woman learning that absence had been necessary, not as punishment for those who overlooked her, but as gift to herself. Time and space to remember who she was, beneath the accumulated weight of others' expectations. The art school was challenging and exhilarating. Millicent was indeed a beginner, fumbling with brushes and mixing colours with more enthusiasm than skill. But her instructors saw something in her work, not technical mastery, but feeling. The ability to capture emotion in a line, to convey truth through composition. "You paint like someone who has truly looked at the world," Signor Benedetti told her. "Not just seen, but looked. That is rarer than technique." She made friends, other students from across Europe, all chasing the same dream of creating something beautiful. They knew nothing of Ashford Manor or aristocratic obligations. They knew only that Millicent was kind, talented, willing to laugh at her mistakes and celebrate others' successes. She was simply herself, and herself was enough. Millicent wrote long letters to Lord Ashford, describing every painting she saw, every sculpture, every church and street and vista. She sketched the Duomo and the Ponte Vecchio and sent the drawings along with her letters. His replies grew shorter as his strength faded, but each one radiated joy. "Your happiness shines through your words, dear Millie. I can die content knowing you've found yourself." 3 months passed like a dream. When it came time to decide whether to extend her stay or return to England, Millicent stood on the Ponte Vecchio at sunset, watching the Arno turn to liquid gold, and made her choice. She would return. Not because she had to, not because anyone needed her, but because she wanted to, because Ashford Manor, transformed by absence and return, had become something different, not a prison or obligation, but simply a place where she had people she cared about and work that mattered. She would return, but on her terms, spending part of the year in Italy, part in England, living her life in the in-between spaces, claiming both worlds rather than being trapped in one. She would return because she finally understood that home was not a place that held you captive. Home was a place you chose, again and again, with full knowledge of what it offered and what it cost, with eyes wide open and heart fully engaged. And Ashford Manor, for all its flaws and its history, had earned the right to be called home, not through ownership or obligation, but through change, through recognition, through the slow, imperfect work of becoming worthy of her presence. Millicent arrived back in England on a crisp autumn morning. George met her at the station, and his smile told her everything before he spoke a word. "Father passed 3 weeks ago, peacefully in his sleep. He was reading your last letter when it happened." Sorrow washed over her, but it was clean sorrow, uncomplicated by regret or unsaid words. "I'm glad he knew I was happy," she said quietly. "He left you something, beyond the income he'd already arranged. The groundskeeper's cottage and 10 acres surrounding it. He said you'd know what to do with it." Millicent closed her eyes, overwhelmed. The cottage where she'd first learned to claim space for herself, land enough to build a life. A final gift from the one person who had wanted her happiness more than her usefulness. "And there's something else," George added gently. He left a letter. She read it that evening in her rooms at the manor, the familiar East Wing suite that had become genuinely hers. "My dearest Millie, if you're reading this, I've gone ahead to whatever awaits us beyond this life. I hope I find Thomas and your son waiting, and I hope I can tell them that I tried, however belatedly, to care for you as they would have wished. The cottage is yours because it represents what you gave yourself when we failed to give it to you. Space to breathe, to be, to remember who you were. I hope you'll use it to continue becoming who you're meant to be. Your absence taught this household, taught me, to see what we'd overlooked. Your pain was never invisible because it didn't exist. It was invisible because we chose not to look. That choice shames me more than any other I've made. But your absence also taught us something else, that a life can be remade, that worth is intrinsic, not assigned by others, that the most powerful thing a person can do is choose themselves, even when it costs them everything familiar. You chose yourself, Millie, and in doing so, you taught us to do better. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for giving us the chance to be worthy of you. Thank you for existing, for enduring, for transforming pain into grace. Thank you for being you. With all my love and admiration, Lord Ashford Millicent folded the letter carefully and added it to her collection. Testaments to being seen across time and circumstance by people who had learned to truly look. She had been invisible for so long. But invisibility, she had discovered, was not a permanent state. It was a choice others made, and she had learned finally to choose differently for herself, to claim space, to demand recognition, to exist not in service to others' comfort, but in honor of her own humanity. Millicent Ashford had disappeared, and in her absence they had felt everything she had quietly sustained. But more importantly, in her absence, she had found herself, and that self was worth celebrating, worth protecting, worth choosing again and again for the rest of her days. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the Manor Tales channel and liking this video. Your support helps us bring more stories to life. Would you have had the courage to walk away as Millicent did, knowing you might lose everything? Which moment of quiet strength meant the most to you? Her departure, her time alone, or her decision to return on her own terms?